In the early hours of Wednesday, September 10th, numerous Russian drones violated Polish airspace. NATO's air defenses were activated and successfully ensured the defense of NATO territory. Whilst this was the largest concentration of violations of NATO airspace that we have seen, what happened on Wednesday was not an isolated incident.
The drone incursions into Polish airspace in early September marked a new chapter in Russia's enduring gray zone campaign of escalation against NATO. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk put it bluntly, "This is the closest we've come to open conflict since the Second World War."
Russia's recklessness in the air along our eastern flank is increasing in frequency. We have seen drones violate our airspace in Romania, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Whether intentional or not, it is dangerous and unacceptable.
Welcome back to The Ties That Bind, NATO Allies in Action. I'm Natalia Kapitnik, the Communications Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and your host this season. Now, last year we started this project on the eve of NATO's 75th anniversary, speaking to experts and career diplomats who walked us through the history of the alliance, its evolution, its enduring role in transatlantic security, and its role in supporting Ukraine's war effort. There were definitely some fascinating conversations there, so do check out those earlier episodes. Now, this season we are looking at the alliance from a bit of a different angle. Now, I'm not a security expert, so if you're looking for a deep dive on weapon systems and military strategy, I can certainly recommend one of our many other projects, such as Behind the Front. But this season, I wanted to look at regional perspectives from the frontline states. How are the frontline states investing and planning in their defense? How are they thinking about their role and contributions within the alliance and on the world stage? How have their historical experiences shaped how their governments and societies think about their own defense, countering disinformation, their own democratic institutions, changing economic realities, and how they are preparing as a society for a potential conflict with Russia? From the American perspective, it is easy to think of membership in NATO as a given. After all, the US was a founding member, and a lot of time has passed since 1949. But for frontline NATO members, whose memory of membership is just a few decades long, the perception is quite different and frankly fascinating. This week, we are looking at Poland, a country that has completely transformed its military and defense capacity, its economy, and its democratic institutions, investing more than any other NATO ally in its defense. But periods of transition are not always painless, and they don't come without difficulty, and we'll be hearing what challenges and opportunities Poland is facing as it looks to become a leading voice within the alliance and on the world stage. Thanks for joining us.
To get a sense of the current environment in Poland, I spoke with Jakub Romaniuk, FPI Fellow and Program Director at the Warsaw-based Foundation Institute for Eastern Studies, the organizer of the annual Economic Forum, a leading platform for dialogue in Central Europe for over 30 years.
So we are recording this on September 22nd. It's been 2 weeks since at least 21 Russian drones flew into Polish airspace, prompting NATO to scramble jets and to shoot down some of them. Poland since then has formally requested the activation of Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which mandates consultations among member states whenever any of them perceive a threat to their territorial integrity. And Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk warned at the time that the incursions were the closest we have ever been to open conflict since World War II. Since then, a Russian drone has also crossed into Romanian airspace. Russian fighter jets violated Estonian airspace. Poland closed its border with Belarus amid heightened security concerns during Russia's military exercises. And in response, NATO has launched the Eastern Sentry operation, which will increase air patrols and ground-based interceptor systems. Tensions are understandably high in the frontline states, and it does seem like maybe there is a greater realization that hypotheticals are becoming a reality, which I think, especially in Poland, I don't think anyone is surprised because, of course, Poland, along with the Baltic states and others, has been quite vocal about the Russian threat far before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So, Jakub, I'm curious to hear from you. What is the sentiment domestically about the recent drone incursions? Do you get a sense that Poles are confident in NATO's defense response? Do you think that these events will finally force some European leaders to really start thinking more in a wartime mentality than a peacetime mentality?
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. The sentiment is certainly not positive. So this was a very, very serious violation of Poland's security. And everyone in Poland, as you said, is well aware that this was not an accident, but a deliberate act. So it was just another provocation on the part of Russia. But of course, this causes justified concerns among the citizens about our security, about the future of Poland. More and more often, conversations are filled with increasingly vocal questions about whether Poland is still a safe place. I talked with many of my friends, and they are also starting to think about maybe finding a second house somewhere in the western part of Europe or the southern part of Europe. Italy and Spain are becoming more and more available for Poles, so they are still thinking about maybe having a second place to live in the future, especially after the last drone incursions. So the situation is serious, I think. As you said, like Prime Minister Tusk said, it was really, we are a little bit closer to the war. Of course, we are not in the state of war, but like Premier Tusk said, the parliament. The enemy does not hide its hostile intentions. And what is important, even though we see in the last weeks that Prime Minister Tusk and President Nawrocki, they have, let's say, different approach to the foreign policy, but they're both agreed that the Russian provocation was nothing more than just an attempt to test our capabilities and our response. So fortunately, our authorities responded well. They responded quickly in appropriate manner. Also, what is really important for us, our allies in NATO responded very well. So, as you said, like the jet fighters, they were really quickly in the air zone of Poland, and they shot it down these drones. So it was really important that everyone acted really quickly in the first few hours. Of course, there were also some informations about some missing drones somewhere in Poland. So our authorities, they were searching for the, let's say, some parts of the missiles and the drones in the different parts of Poland, but everything was quite safe. Let's say that there was only one let's say, accident with the house because like one part of the missile just fell on the rooftop. So fortunately, no one was injured. So everything really ended in a good manner. But as President and Prime Minister said that we passed this test, also the NATO passed this test. So I think that we can also see this in a latest public opinion polls that were published 2 or 3 days ago, that we asked the Poles, so do you believe that NATO allies would help Poland in the case of aggression against our country? And 57% responded yes. Only 26% responded no, and 17% they had no opinion on this matter. So this is important that people believe that NATO is still there, is working well, what we could see during the drone incursions. So it is important to have these allies with us, especially that we are at the border of war in Ukraine. So as you said, also the close border with Belarus, also the new project of the East Shield. We are trying to be more and more aware on the potential aggression from Russia and from Belarus. Also in the same public opinion polls, there were the other questions, like, for example, how much trust does the Polish society have in NATO? And it is like the very positive answer because 76% of Poles, they trust in NATO. So it is almost 2% more than last year, but the peak was in 22, which cannot be a surprise for us. And it was at the level of 82%, but it's still really high. So it's good that people in Poland, they are still believing in NATO, in our allies. So they do in our Polish army, because, like, for example, the trust in Polish army is at the level of 94% and is the highest ever. So this is important that we see not only the NATO as a guarantee of our security, but also the Polish army, which is, of course, the part of NATO, can also secure our future in Poland. So this is, I think, really important in these uncertain days, let's say.
Yes, definitely. And you mentioned some of those differences in rhetoric of Donald Tusk versus President Karol Nawrocki. I definitely think it's important to have a little context on the domestic front when talking about Poland's role in NATO, and in the context of heightened security concerns, especially in light of recent events. You recently wrote an article this summer for FPRI analyzing the 2025 Polish presidential election, which resulted, of course, in the election of Karol Nawrocki. He had run as an independent, but was supported by the Law and Justice Party, which, of course, is the ideological opposition party to Prime Minister Donald Tusk's coalition government, which came into power last fall. As you pointed out in your article, Nawrocki has quite a history of controversy, controversial statements, controversial behaviors. You can read about all of that in Jakub's article, which we'll link in the description of this episode. But he has in many ways followed the tradition of Law and Justice's Jarosław Kaczyński, weaponizing historical and cultural divisions, especially between Poland and Ukraine, seemingly to rev up his base, notably, of course, the Volhynia massacre. And he has been somewhat lukewarm, at least during his campaign, on Ukraine's NATO and EU ambitions. Now, of course, Poland's reputation in Europe during the Law and Justice era was certainly not without difficulty, but since the new coalition government, there has seemingly been a bit of a reset with relations, especially with the EU. But now with President Nawrocki, despite not having any official capacity to run the foreign policy of Poland, he does seem to have warm relations with President Trump. So it feels like it's a bit of a curious time for Poland on the foreign policy stage, with President Nawrocki finding some commonality with President Trump, even someone getting his endorsement during his campaign, meeting with him in DC recently in September. That meeting seemed to have resulted in at least verbal commitments to maintain, if not potentially increase, the U.S. military presence in Poland. So what's your take on all of this? Is Nawrocki's reputation as kind of a rough and tumble guy, an outsider, someone who wants to shake up things politically, much like Trump did, of course, back in 2015, 2016, and arguably to this day, is that reputation somewhat beneficial for Poland from a security standpoint? If Nawrocki is in favor with Trump, could it be a useful tool in reaffirming American security guarantees on the continent?
Well, I really hope, because, as you said, there was an image of during the campaign. There was an image of let's say, some kind of friendship between Donald Trump and Karol Nawrocki. Of course, when we look at the campaign, we can see some similarities to the American campaign, to let's say, the idea of Donald Trump as a president was somehow translated into Polish ground in the posture of Karol Nawrocki. So he was made, let's say, in some kind similar candidate as Donald Trump, to be an independent, solid, strong candidate who will be the best option for the times of war. And that was, for example, why he won. So people wanted to have a strong president during the times of war in Poland. But the problem is that president is not creating the foreign policy in Poland, because the government does it. So the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Deputy Prime Minister Radosław Sikorski, and also Deputy Prime Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, so the Minister of Defense, and of course Prime Minister Donald Tusk. They are the most important figures when it comes to the foreign policy and security. But the problem is that the president of Poland is the chief of staff of the Polish army. So that's the problem, that we have two very distant positions inside of Polish politics, and they have to act together to find a balance and to find one common, let's say, language to speak to the other countries, to help not only Poland but also, of course, Ukraine. And this kind of problem is that, as you said, Karol Nawrocki in the past wasn't, let's say, the biggest friend of Ukraine. He was using our past and some problems with the Polish citizens in Ukraine and at the Ukrainian border to gain some of the votes during the campaign from the far right voters. So this is a problem. Fortunately, since he became a president, he didn't say a word about our past, about Ukraine, about these relations. So I hope it will be in the future in the same way. Right now, there are some major problems. Then speaking about the past between Poland and Ukraine, and we know that we have to help Ukraine. This is the first thing we have to do. So I really hope that Karol Nawrocki and the potential good relations with Donald Trump will help us to be an important part of the transatlantic relations and also the European security. But the problem is, because on one hand, yeah, of course, as you said, he was invited to DC. and they had some meetings. Right now, he will be speaking also at the United Nations. So, yeah, it's good that he's there. But when we see at the last meeting in August, meeting concerning European security and war in Ukraine, Donald Trump invited some European leaders from Germany, France, of course, NATO, Italy, and other states, but there was no place for Poland. So the question is there really a good relation between some kind of friendship between Donald Trump and Karol Nawrocki or not? It was just only for the needs of the campaign. So we don't know yet how it will happen, what will happen in the future, but I really hope that, of course, being the same side of the politics as Donald Trump will help Poland to be there, and that the Polish voice will be heard in Washington, D.C.
For many years, a leading Polish voice on the foreign policy stage was Anna Fotyga, who launched her political career as part of Solidarność, the trade union that served as a linchpin in ending the Cold War. Anna served as Poland's foreign minister between 2006 and 2007 and held many high-level government positions, including chair of the chancellery under the late President Lech Kaczyński. She also served as the deputy mayor of Gdańsk, her hometown, as well as several terms in the Polish Sejm and in the European Parliament, where she chaired its Security and Defense Subcommittee. In 2020, she was appointed by then Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg as part of NATO's Reflection Group, a working group of 10 high-level experts that work to create recommendations aimed at strengthening NATO's political role in tackling the threats of the next decade. I spoke with Anna about Poland's goals within the alliance during a decade of great transition. So, you became the foreign minister in 2006, arguably also a very formative time for Polish foreign policy and security. Of course, Poland joined NATO in 1999, later the European Union in 2004, and it was such a period of transition, right, in that whole decade. Could you tell us a little bit about Poland within the NATO context during that first decade of the 2000s and how you were thinking about Poland and its goals and its role in the alliance during this time, and perhaps how you would assess its evolution in this context over almost 3 decades now?
My perception of threats, and actually many people I used to work with include first and foremost my friend, my authority, my boss, the late president of Poland, Lech Kaczyński, who used to be also a prominent person of Poland's anti-communist opposition. We were absolutely aware since the very beginning in political life of ongoing threats from first the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation. These threats were not so visible probably after changes happening in Central and Eastern Europe, then reunification of Germany, because at that time, earlier the Soviet Union, later Russian Federation, was considerably militarily and politically weak or weaker, I would say, still playing important role because of possession of nuclear arsenal. But also because of changes, this position was different. To a person like myself, 2 Chechen wars, actually what happened also in Georgia, early 90s, and later on many other signals were, I would say, very obvious sign of ongoing neo-imperial posture of the Russian Federation. Actually, all my public life, I used to warn international community, so the collective West, about these threats. And actually, it is somehow tragic that we were not to adopt a very firm attitude vis-a-vis these threats much earlier. I think that war waged by Russia, because I'm absolutely clear, it was not mutual teasing. It was war waged by Russia on Georgia, 2008, and annexation of a quite large part of Georgian territory. We have creeping borderization going all the time. I think that in terms of Georgia, we've made, the collective West, many mistakes. Society and country trying to move towards the West. And Georgia has always been West bounding. So seeing, and Georgians in particular were always looking towards the West, trying to have as much in common with Western culture, Western institutions as possible. So I am, with all difficulties within the West, seeing all mistakes and actually sometimes purely economic interest prevailing over hard security interests and constraints. I still feel it is extremely important to maintain unity that is very, very fragile. I saw this during all my time in Western institutions, predominantly within the EU institution, being it Council. As foreign minister, I used to participate and actually, with some very few exceptions, personally participating in all council formats that were attached to the position of foreign minister. I used to accompany prime ministers earlier than the president to the highest level, so council summits, European summits, and also NATO summits, including famous Bucharest summit. And then, despite our enormous efforts, my personal efforts as well, we failed. I mean those people who were so engaged in security of my region, because I think that the hesitation to give MAP to Georgia and Ukraine emboldened Russia, not deterred. And actually, it is also the experience of last month that friendly and mild discussion with Russia does not work necessarily. I understand, of course, some meandering of politics. I know how difficult escalation ladder may be, and how important it is to monitor and to control it. But honestly, I'm absolutely sure towards the end of my public life, I'm absolutely sure with my whole life experience that autocratic countries understand very firm language only.
The second decade of Poland's NATO membership was a pivotal turning point in the country's defense strategy and military modernization. Tomasz Szatkowski served as the Deputy Minister of Defense between 2015 and 2019, and later as the Polish ambassador to NATO between 2019 and 2024. I spoke with Ambassador Szatkowski about Poland's strategic defense review, which he led, and how Poland's defense strategy and role within NATO evolved during this time. So you began your tenure as Deputy Minister of Defense shortly after Russia's seizure of Crimea, and you also played a critical role in the development of Poland's strategic defense review in 2017. And then, of course, you served as ambassador to NATO during the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, which is obviously the war is still ongoing today. Arguably, both times, your time in service was an incredibly transformative time for Polish defense. So based on your experiences, how do you assess Poland's most notable defense achievements and developments, both during your role as Deputy Defense Minister and as ambassador to NATO?
I would say that Poland has been one of the champions of the collective defense as the primary role of the alliance. When we joined NATO in 1999, this is what we were viewing as the primary role of NATO. However, at that time, NATO was transforming from a mostly defensive alliance into something I would say was in search of its mission, of its purpose. The prevailing view at the time was that NATO would become something like a mechanism, like a sort of toolbox to help stabilize different troubled areas around the world. Was the area of so-called, if you're not out of area, you're out of business, meaning we have to intervene in distant areas that our security has been decided at the valleys of Panjshir in Afghanistan and elsewhere. I mean, that, of course, I'm already mentioning the global war on terror. This is something what Poland joined as an understanding that we have to share our burdens, we have to share to help each other, being members of the alliance. But at the same time, let's say Poland's concerns, Poland was all the time aware of threats coming possibly from Russia, were largely dismissed. And even in around 2000, there was still some residues of the old culture from the Cold War. They were fading away to the point that around 2010, Poland had to bargain for contingency planning, even very notional level, to be reestablished somehow in the alliance in order to at least think of what would happen if NATO was to resort to its original task, its original mission, namely the collective defense of the territory of its allies. That all changed in 2014. Suddenly, everybody had to realize that the reality they were projecting in their minds was not exactly the reality we were living in, and that there were still state actors that had some aggressive ambitions and plans, and they were open and willing to use brute force in order to put those plans into fruition. Therefore, NATO also had to adapt. And so I was able to witness almost the entire process of NATO's adaptation and basically bringing back some of its original functions, collective defense, with all its features, including command structure, political military relationship, but at the same time adapting them to the times that we currently live in. We are not anymore in the 80s or 70s. There are new communication means, new social phenomena. So, of course, we didn't also want to lose the expertise that was gained in NATO throughout the time. But Poland, to our consciousness of the threats coming mainly from the east, I would say we were one of the intellectual leaders of that process, even if that wasn't always acknowledged, both in military and kind of strategic domains. So you already mentioned the strategic defense review that I had an honor to lead back in 2016-17. At the time, we restored some of the notions like that. Some of the notions were actually forgone in other NATO military, so that it isn't just what was dubbed as quality, it's also quantity of forces. It is also not just an ability to project power outside, it's also an ability to have a capacity to defend your territory, to have a power to withstand an attritional mode of fighting. We were having all those notions in mind. We actually adapted, interestingly, a Russian or Chinese concept of an anti-access and area denial in order to build on what Clausewitz defined as the stronger form of warfare, which is defense. We thought that as defensive alliance, we can actually build on these notions. We then used this experience influencing the new strategic concept that was being developed in the alliance. For instance, the very notion of deterrence by denial. So basically, instead of just reacting and being in a reactionary mode and sort of sending forces while something has happened, we would create conditions so that a possible adversary wouldn't conduct a surprise attack against NATO. So that was basically about bringing some notions like, the preparations of a terrain, perhaps creating a mass of the reserve personnel, something that was not very much talked about during 90s, 2000s, and so on and so on. We, of course, were able to cooperate with like-minded people, military, mostly military people, but there was some civilians, very notable civilians in NATO military and civilian structures who still were intellectually were able to go back to the end of the Cold War, but also went through the entire process of the previous adaptation. So when NATO was adapting to those out of area threats, and we also able to use their expertise and work together on bringing those concepts about within the alliance.
I mean, as you kind of touched upon, since Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Poland has really emerged as one of Ukraine's key allies, providing weapons, providing aid, providing refuge for people leaving Ukraine, and also as a kind of key actor in rallying international support to defend Ukraine. I think something like 90% of weapons and aid go through the airport in Rzeszów, of course, in Poland. So I think this underscores the kind of critical role the country plays in both NATO and European efforts to support Ukraine. But yet, on the flip side, it does seem that often Poland is somewhat left out of these key summits, key discussions about the security situation, which, you know, given recent events, the drone incursions and the things that are happening on the eastern flank, as a frontline state, that must be both concerning and also frustrating, right? I think, you know, former President Duda, who you served with, was quite vocal about his frustration over the years about Poland being left out of key international discussions on this topic. And generally, it seems that Polish leadership over the last few years has been quite vocal about having more NATO in Poland and more Poland in NATO, right? So certainly as you're in your tenure in both of your government roles, you were kind of instrumental in working to see more of a NATO presence in Poland. What is your assessment of the situation today in terms of Poland's both influence and leadership within the alliance?
Yeah, you're right. You're much right. I mean, you touched on that, but we didn't expand much on the fact that indeed the NATO presence has grown much during the last 10 years in Poland. It was something that was unthinkable before. Poland and other Eastern flank countries were sort of like a buffer zone within the alliance. So there was this provision of the Declaration of Strategic Partnership with Russia, which was called the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which basically was seen as limiting the ability to deploy NATO forces into those countries, even though it wasn't exactly the case. But yeah, at the same, I mean, that was sort of we were able to change the paradigm of thinking on that. But when it comes to more of the political role, more of the agency, indeed, there is still much work to be done. I would say the old stereotypes don't go away easily, and cultural perceptions. And there is still a tendency to think of the countries from the Eastern flank, mostly as new members. And Poland has been in NATO for 28 years. And I don't think that other NATO countries, after they were 28 years in the alliance, they were still defined as new members. Of course, nobody is using that term, but there is this perhaps notion that maybe the countries from the Eastern flank are more kind of like recipients of security rather than donators of security, which I think perhaps is particularly misleading in case of Poland, which possesses one of the largest military within the alliance and is quite critical in terms of providing security for a number of its neighbors. And I remember one situation where there was a discussion in a narrow circle in the alliance and how can we help Turkey, because which at the time was felt being kind of abandoned or and then somebody said, well, I mean, turning around, guys, I don't think that you can contribute, but maybe you can think of something. I was like, well, I mean, we actually can contribute, and turned out that Poland was one of the few countries that could contribute, sending a contingent of maritime patrol aircraft plus some specialized troops. But, those stereotypes, I would say they change more rapidly in the military domain because military people are more aware of Poland, of what Poland and other countries is actually capable of. But for many of my colleagues and for people who work on political level at NATO, I would say many of them do not have sufficient military expertise, or sometimes, they would have to check the numbers or something, and then sometimes do not realize what is the actual role of my country. And that is, for instance, represented by the result of the stereotypes is represented by the fact that I would say Poland is insufficiently represented at the top echelons of the NATO headquarters. And then there is also the issue of decision making. Of course, everybody knows that we have our own views, and we also can sometimes assertively express them. We actually, I think, it's not very well known, but we've almost blocked the NATO communique from being adopted during two subsequent NATO summits, because we thought that our views, which were legitimate, were not sufficiently taken on board. But it isn't always a habit to bring Poland on board early or within, some sort of an initial decision-making cycle. On one hand, people will say, yeah, well, of course, Poland is one of the largest countries within the alliance, one of the largest allies. But somehow, I wouldn't say this is. I mean, again, the makeup of the NATO headquarters leadership also represents the fact. I mean, or I can give you another example. There is NATO headquarters is made up of, political leadership, but there's also an administration. There's a civilian administration, there's a military administration. The civilian is called international staff. There was a number of cases where I was representing Poland at the alliance, and Poland was more than 20 years already an ally, and I had to make a precedent where I would actually convince some of the leaders, or actually of those divisions of the international staff, that Poland needs to be. I mean, there needs to be some people from Poland actually represented in those divisions. And some of those were really critical for NATO, like defense policy and planning divisions, where prior to my service in the headquarters, Poland had nobody out of 80 people working there.
I liked how you kind of said that it's a lot of it is kind of beating the stereotypes of Poland being a recipient versus a provider of security. And it does feel like, I think Poland is on track to meet 4.7% of GDP on defense spending this year, which is the highest in the alliance, higher than the United States. So it feels like the capacity for being a provider of security is outpacing the rate at which the stereotypes can change.
Indeed, but also, other domains. Let me just add. I also had a privilege of teaching a course this semester to a group of American students from one of the renowned universities, and we are having a discussion on the adaptation of NATO, and they said, well, there's certainly some problem. We heard there's like infrastructure in the east isn't developed, and I was like, I mean, what kind of infrastructure you're talking about? Have you been to Poland? Have you seen Polish highways and Polish railway? I mean, you can compare it to a number of other countries in the old sort of Europe. So there's a tendency to just basically assume that somehow eastern part of the alliance is more backward, less developed, and everything, which isn't always the case. In reality, sometimes there are areas where some eastern flank countries are more developed, actually, both in terms of infrastructure and capabilities.
As we've heard from our guests, Poland's been playing a key role in securing the eastern flank and supporting Ukraine's war effort. Now, at the beginning of the conflict, of course, there was a strong wave of solidarity with Ukraine, which manifested itself in massive humanitarian aid and military support. Now, the military support is, of course, continuing. And who can forget the moving images and stories of Poles handing out soup and sandwiches at the border and developing housing and assistance programs at breakneck speed to accommodate the over 1 million Ukrainians fleeing the war. Now, for a country with a difficult history and attitudes towards refugees and migration, it felt like perhaps a turning point. However, 3 years after the outbreak of the war, these emotions are beginning to change. Poles are increasingly expressing concerns about the prolonged conflict and its impact on the Polish economy and security.
One cannot talk about Poland without talking about history. Do you see potential, if there is at least danger in Polish society about Kremlin narratives, maybe not about defense spending and things like that, but do you see there is more potential for exploiting divisions between Poland and Ukraine to discourage Poles from supporting the war effort?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that unfortunately, we can see it. A few months ago, there was the other poll that they showed that unfortunately the relations between Poles and the Ukrainians, which are residents right now in Poland, are not really good. So, for example, like a lot of people from Ukraine, they are talking about some kind of aggression towards them from the Polish citizens. I think it's also caused by the implications of the social dynamics but also the economy. Even though the Ukrainians and especially the Ukrainian refugees, they have a great input to Polish economy. right now it's almost 3% of the GDP. So it's really a huge impact that they have on Polish economy, and it's great that we have them with us. Of course, there are some problems that they are not always able to find a proper job for them. They're really well qualified, but they are, let's say, taking the jobs from the lowest level. So it also helps the Polish economy because we don't have a problem with unemployment and the other stuff. So it's great. Also, there is a lot of disinformation, as you said, and also far-right parties are using these facts. Well, they're not facts. This is information, let's say, to gain more votes in the future elections in 1.5 years. So it's scary, really, because the problem is that we have 1 million refugees from Ukraine in Poland. But in total, probably we have approximately 2 million Ukrainians in Poland. There are a lot, and we have to coexist, and we have to live together. They are our neighbors. So I saw something great in the first few months, in the first year of the war in Ukraine. Everyone was helping Ukrainians. Everyone wanted them here. Also, there is a major concern about the future of Ukrainians in Poland because we can see that. And also, when I speak with my friends from Ukraine right here, they also say that sometimes there are some problems. So, for example, in the underground, in trains, in buses, that people are not so, let's say, positive to the Ukrainians as they were 2 years ago, year ago. Unfortunately, we can see some tensions. Fortunately, they are not on a high level right now, but I think that we need maybe some new media campaign from the government just to explain that it is good that we have Ukrainians because they help our economy, that we can coexist together here in Poland.
Because we had to very quickly accommodate enormous wave of refugees. We had simply to do it quickly without long thinking, planning, program involving deep programs. Now, time is also to amend some things, and they are always very difficult and very painful. Remember, there is still an enormous group of Ukrainians. They are among our kids in schools. They are among us. They help us in many things, and I always talk to my people that we have to remember they fight also our cause. And second, and probably most important, is agricultural thing and protests of Polish farmers. And that is extremely difficult. It should be sorted out. My view was that it requires very global attitude because from the very beginning, common agricultural policy was the core of European policy. Ukraine, with all differences of the structure of Ukrainian agriculture, not only structure, also natural conditions, excellent soil, prevailing excellent, so very competitory agriculture, immediate influx of products on Ukrainian territory, mean actually collapse of the whole enormous. We are still agricultural industrial country, so agricultural sector is the most or one of the most important sectors in Poland's economy. Always within the EU, it was long adjustment with the accession, really very long adjustment of agriculture to the EU methods because of war, because of support for Ukraine. We refrained from, or we resigned temporarily, I mean the EU, from, and the most punished, I would say, group of people were probably Polish farmers.
The reason that we started this podcast series last year at FPRI was kind of in the background of the 75th anniversary of NATO and kind of reflecting on the alliance as a whole, why it was started, why it still matters. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you see Poland's now 26 years in the alliance. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that moment in time, 1999? What was the atmosphere like? You mentioned you saw the accession kind of talks firsthand. What was that like? And then I guess to follow up, what areas do you feel like Poland has really emerged as a leader in NATO, especially when thinking about this kind of transition from becoming a security receiver to becoming a security provider of its own right?
Well, that is a major change, of course. There were groups in Poland, I would say very early, dreaming about accession to major Western institutions, predominantly NATO, but also the EU. Myself, I was among them, even during my studies. It was foreign trade, international economic relations. So I saw chances in eventual, although I was, even for me, it was so deeply involved in polling, opposing the system. Actually, achieving this change was also a surprise, a joyous surprise. I must admit, I did not foresee difficulties in changing system, how long, how painfully it has to be maintained, continued sector by sector. We still have many things that have to be changed and reformed according to Western rules. I would say that the legal system, judiciary is still challenge ahead of us. I deeply believe in importance to keep tradition, including many aspects of sovereign decision making within the allied country or EU member state. So belonging to NATO, accession to NATO was always dream of part. Luckily, supporting group was rather linked to earlier Solidarność than to the outgoing leaders or elites. Actually, many of former elites, communist elites, were against this accession. But when it happened, paradoxically, they started to adjust quicker and earlier, at least vocally. They appeared to the collective West as easiest, I would say, interlocutor, because those who have experience of fight for freedom, of pace taken to adjust, to change, to combat, to control large groups of society, not to for them not to suffer, they are probably more cautious and less willing to adopt easy methods or external patterns in many ways. They remain dedicated to some extent to their own path. But luckily, this support for NATO increased over years. We had always difficulty in reforming the army, but actually years of engagement. And I would say that policy of the late president, Lech Kaczynski, of course, I always return to his time. He was very much in favor of Poland's deep engagement in joint NATO endeavors, being it in many countries, feeling that this real combat or semi-combat experience in providing security is of utmost importance, that we sooner or later we were simply we were to make this step. So we've been prepared by earlier leaders, and in particular President Kaczynski, to this step. Of course, war on Georgia, war on Ukraine was a wake-up call for a large part of society. And nowadays, among other countries, we are very lucky because I think that it is prevailing and much larger group of Polish societies supporting expenditures on security, on army, on capabilities, on now many aspects of preparedness, of building resilience of the country, of civil protection, of measures taken on every level of society to make us fit for defending country and our allies as well.
Doing a little bit of reading about this time of a session, I found this great quote by President Alexander Kwaśniewski, who was speaking in Washington in 1999. It was the 50th anniversary of NATO's founding, which was shortly after Poland's accession, and he said, "For the Polish people, NATO's existence has always been a sign of hope. The hope of saving freedom and democracy in a Europe divided until 1989, the hope that the Iron Curtain would not last forever, the hope that as soon as Poland was able to determine its fate, it would take part in the creation of a better future for itself and for the whole of the European continent." And he said, "The dreams of our fathers and grandfathers have now come true." Now, arguably 1999 was, depending on how you look at it, not that long ago. Certainly the memory of this moment is still living in several generations in Polish society. So my question is, do you think that Poles today still see the alliance through that lens of hope? And does the relative novelty almost of belonging to NATO, at least compared to the American experience of being a founding member back in 1949, help explain why Poland has been so ambitious in its defense vision? And lastly, I guess, do you see that belonging to NATO has become a kind of core element of Polish identity?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it was a really, really important and a groundbreaking event, because when we said it, we can see that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of Warsaw Pact, after the end of the Cold War, it opened up the possibility for the further NATO enlargement. So it was something unthinkable before. If you could ask anyone in 1989 to have countries from the Warsaw Pact standing together with the allies from the NATO, it was surreal. So it was a groundbreaking experience, I think, and it was great. It was planned for the 50th anniversary also. So it was really, really a fantastic idea. So in March 1999, the former members of Warsaw Pact, they joined NATO, Poland, Hungary, and Czechia. So it was groundbreaking event, really. So for our part of Europe, it was a fantastic experience. As you quoted, Alexander Kwaśniewski words, this is just what NATO was for Poland. It was also the final step of the democratic transition in the 90s, because of course in 89 we just became, let's say, the free sovereign country. But it lasted for 4 years when we became, let's say, truly kind of Western country. So it was the last step to become a part of the Western civilization. We didn't want to be a part of, let's say, Eastern Europe or Russia's, let's say, area of interest anymore. So that's why we joined NATO. I remember it was really important. I was 10 at the at the time, but it was a really important thing. And I remember everyone was really happy that finally we are becoming a part of Western world. The same in 5 years later when we joined the European Union. So last year we had 2 great anniversaries, 25 years in NATO and 20 years in the European Union. So right now, when you ask the Poles, as I showed you in the recent public opinion polls, no one can imagine Poland without NATO, without European Union. This is just some kind of a normal thing for us that Poland is part of these organizations, and everyone wants Poland to be there still in the future. So there is, I think, no question about this, and everyone wants to be a part of this. And of course, we believe that it will help us. NATO is still one of the pillars of the Polish security. Right now, we are trying to be one of the leaders of NATO, especially when we see that the center of gravity, it goes towards the eastern flank. So Poland is becoming more and more important as not only as a member, but one of the leaders of NATO, let's say. And I really hope we will be able to stand as one of the leaders also in the future. Poles, they're really believing in Article 5. Let's hope we'll not have to check if it will be working well. But everyone in Poland is always saying that, but we have Article 5. We are in NATO, so we are safe.
When Poland joined NATO in 1999, then Prime Minister Jerzy Buzek, in his first address to the Council, to the North Atlantic Council, he said, Poland does not enter NATO with empty hands. We contribute not only our territory, but our people. You can count on us. You can count on Poland. So I kind of wanted to ask you a little about how you assess Poland's time in the alliance since 1999. Do you think that this pledge, you can count on us? I mean, you kind of just underscored that Poles feel that sense of duty of defense and that they are not expecting any kind of free handouts. Do you think that approach still has fueled or come to define Poland and how it views its place within NATO?
Well, absolutely. Also, I mean, this is one of the slogans from the time when Poland was fighting to regain its freedom was for your freedom and ours. I think it resonates well in the US. So this is an affinity in terms of the values, also an affinity in terms of this perception that in order to have freedom, we need to be ready for sacrifices for freedom of others. And I think we've already proved that very early on in the alliance, and actually prior to joining the alliance, we've been a loyal ally in a number of missions, regardless of whether those missions or were, the correct decisions. Looking from the hindsight, like the Iraq War of 2003 up until 2009, we were there with the US. We were in Afghanistan from the beginning till the end. And also we were one of the, and this is something that, comes back in almost each of my conversations with the US military, where they always say, well, we were in Afghanistan, and we remember that Poles were one of the very few allies that did go with us everywhere. So there were nations that had caveats on the use of force. Poland didn't, Polish forces didn't. Our troops were ready to fight alongside the US allies. So we're ready to be with our allies in good and bad.
I think to tie it into my final question here, one of the things that I'm asking all of our guests this season, because one of the aims of this season is really to kind of foster understanding between our American listeners, our audience, and to get some regional perspectives. So what would you like Americans specifically to understand about kind of Poland's contributions and role in transatlantic security, and ultimately the importance of preserving NATO as an alliance?
Poland has already demonstrated its key to preserving Ukraine's fight, as you mentioned in this conversation. Poland is very critical to NATO's defense of the eastern flank, and Poland is a loyal ally that, in peacetime and in the time of a war, is ready to share the burden and shed blood together. I think this is something what I hope you speakers understand, and I will continue to understand and believe.
We are society that is extremely transatlantically oriented. That is because of Poland's history. There are so many Americans of Polish origin still there, and they are linked to their families. They feel this spirit of security. Of course, there were difficult times in the relationship between Poland and US, but it is the most important ally for I think all of us. And in this, I do not see major divisions within Polish society. We know that, there is special kinship between us. I feel it is much easier for me to discuss security, foreign affairs with Americans than many other nations. So we are close. There were Poles in fighting for American freedom.
Indeed.
And there are Americans deeply involved in understanding our common security. I'm always also in support of NATO. We remain a very credible ally, I'm sure.
Americans should understand that just as it is impossible to talk with Russia about Ukraine without Ukraine, it is also impossible to talk about the European security without Poland. Of course, like in the United States, you can think about Russia, about something that is a threat for some people in Ukraine, in Poland, in the Baltic states. Okay, but it doesn't concern us. But of course, thanks to globalizations and all the other processes in the history of our world, we know that everything is connected. So the bigger area of interest of Russia can be a threat also for the United States and the whole Western world. A strong and secure Poland is also essential to guarantee not only Ukraine's security, but also the European security. And what it counts also, I think, somehow the American security.
Thank you to Jakub, Tomasz, and Anna for their time and sharing their insights. Now, this is just a snippet of our conversation. The full interviews with all of our guests will be available in the coming days on the Ties That Bind Substack, so make sure to subscribe at the link in the show notes below to receive those straight into your inbox. This episode was produced by Natalia Kapitnik. Special thanks to Sarah Helena Marapodi and Leah Pedro for production assistance, and Katie Janner for editing. The Ties That Bind is a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, generously supported by the NATO Public Diplomacy Division. For more information about this and other initiatives, please visit us at fpri.org. Until next time.